So kia ora everyone, and thanks for coming along to our September webinar. We've got Dan Charles, the Data Systems Manager with Digital New Zealand, here with us today, and he's presenting the second in our three-part series with Digital New Zealand. So he'll be talking about an introduction to an API, what is it, how it works, and who's using Digital New Zealand's one, and what they're doing with it. He's happy for you to ask questions during the presentation if you like. You can either ask them verbally or type them into the chat box below and I can facilitate those. And we'll also just ask, I think most of you have done it, but just make sure that you've got your microphones muted so there's no noise interference during the presentation. So that's all the boring stuff, and I'll just hand it over to Dan to introduce himself and get started.
All right, thanks, Julia. Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to the introduction to DigitalNZ's API and a strange sort of cross-pollinated PowerPoint presentation between computers and programs. So there's some weird stuff on that first slide already. So we could be in for some excitement as I go through. So let's press a button and hope that I can make it go. Yeah. So what we'll cover today, hopefully, is what is an API, how it works, as Julia said, and well, actually, how it works, more like how to work with it, and yeah, who's using the DigitalNZ API, and some questions at the end. So the first obvious sort of thing to do is unpack the acronym API, but in this case, and kind of quite often with acronyms, I don't find those words especially helpful as like a sentence or explaining anything. So we can dig into each word a little bit to build up maybe a better understanding of what an API is, starting with the middle word, programming. To me, that's sort of like the kind of programmer or developer, coding, kind of nerdy, geeky, kind of fun stuff. And I guess the proper definition of it would be, sort of the instructions, and I guess that's what coding is, instructions for machines. Jumping to the first word, application. I mean, people are generally kind of familiar these days with the rise of smartphones and mobile devices and apps and applications kind of spreading everywhere. Like everyone's probably got Twitter and GeoNet and MetService. They understand that those kind of applications and like the National Library website or DigitalNZ, just websites in general can be thought of as applications in themselves. And if we dig into the National Library website, it's kind of made up of many applications. So the Topic Explorer, image ordering, RealMe, just the search, searching the collections. Those are all sort of different components, like applications that make up the big National Library website and the services that it provides. So then, and they're often designed like that, on purpose. Each component or application is isolated and distinct, so that it can be, changed or improved individually. And there's lots of benefits to that that approach for building software. And like if one component fails, it doesn't bring down the rest of the website in this case. So with all those applications, I guess that leads to the last word, interface, as the communication sort of between all those apps, so that everything runs and each app can keep distinct, keep isolated, sorry. It's kind of helpful to distinguish between an API and a GUI, graphical user interface. So most things are kind of GUIs that humans use, digitally, websites. I mean, unless you're using Linux or command line kind of things, then which is text-based, everything's kind of represented. Humans want buttons and pictures, so it's quite a graphical, visual representation. So with a GUI, there's there's a user on one end and then a computer or an application at the other end. Whereas with an API, it's generally applications at either end or computers at either end, and the API is the communication between those two, the interface between. Analogies can be quite helpful. Messenger, the second one, I quite like that. It's really simple. Don't really need much more explaining. It's an API is quite nice to think of as a messenger between applications. So it doesn't actually have, the API itself doesn't really have the content or the stuff like that's in a database. And equally, it doesn't do any presentation. It doesn't display things. It's just in between one app. An app will focus on the display, and a different app will focus on managing a database or that kind of thing. And the API is the communication layer between them. The waiter, that's really cool. Heard that kind of recently in another presentation. Stole that from another colleague of ours. And that's, you can imagine walking into a restaurant, sitting at a table. You can see the kitchen, and it's making great food. You might even be able to smell it, but you need the waiter to interact between you and the kitchen, and you make a request, and it will communicate that and often get you your food. So that's how an API works. Can be thought of as working. If we step forward to slightly blurry magic hat diagram, what we call at DigitalNZ the magic hat diagram. So this is a really useful visual representation that will help to explain what the DigitalNZ API is and where it sits. And this is the only way I can ever explain DigitalNZ as a whole. So on the left, we've got, some of you might be familiar with it, on the left we've got organisations, people from all different sectors, just all the content that is out there, wherever it is, in whatever format it is, coming into the centre, being the database. DigitalNZ collects the metadata. It maps all the different content to the same kind of metadata schema or to the same place, so that then you get to the magic hat, which represents the API as access to that giant stack of metadata, surfacing it out onto the right hand side for people to use in a variety of different ways. So it enables access so now this is where it could get interesting, but I did get quite carried away. Maybe that's why I was still tinkering with it last minute with PowerPoint and some of the transitions. So this is surely not going to work. As we dive into the API, that was supposed to zoom. But so here we are. This is the API.
It was still quite impressive, Dan, I just wanted to say.
Yeah, beautiful fade.
Yeah.
The zoom would have represented diving in much more elegant. So here's the API. This is what it looks like looking at it at the DigitalNZ API. And I'm going to be pretty biased because I've spent a lot of time looking at this stuff, but it's kind of relatively easy to understand, to comprehend what's there. If you look long enough, you can see various things like that it's from. This is a record from papers past. There's title information. There's no description in this case, but you can see just sort of various metadata about the object that you're seeing. So this is that was the view of an API. As anyone who's looking at APIs should look at it. Whereas in fact, this is what you're going to get without when you aren't sort of ready for it. The raw view of an API output is pretty ugly, and you don't want to waste your time looking at that. So you need to get an extension for your browser. And there are lots of different options. JSON view, this is one. I think I use JSON formatter or formatting, something like that. But you just search wherever you get your extensions from, if you can find that. Search for JSON view, and there'll be options. I usually just choose the most popular one. Where are we? So, I guess you guys can't see that, but there's something popping down. Oh, it's gone. So where are we? So working with an API is a workflow, kind of like a pattern that we should all actually be really familiar. So anyone who's worked, has done anything on the web, on the internet, there's a URL bar at the top, an address bar, and then you sort of press go on that essentially, and you get back some stuff. In this case, it's a visual representation of National Library, their website. But actually underneath that, oh no, we're not going underneath that yet. So still working with the normal way you use the internet, you might know what you want from this website. You might type in librarians up into the URL bar, or you could click through the links, and essentially the same thing happens. So that URL gets put up into the address bar, and then your content will change to be targeted. You're getting what you want on all the content to do with librarians. But under the hood, this is actually what you're getting back is just sort of code, and this is XML code, and it probably makes even less sense than our first view of an API, of the JSON API. And so it's the browser that makes it all look pretty. So, I mean, everything is kind of an API on the internet, just general websites. You make a request and you get back a bunch of stuff. So here's jumping back to a DigitalNZ API call. It's kind of a bit nicer to look at, I feel, compared to a website without the graphical markup. So this is just a few records to do with librarians. So up in the top that I can't see because something keeps popping down, there's just text librarians up in the URL. That's the kind of guts of this API call, in the same way that you can request on the website stuff to do with librarians. Here's another request from the DigitalNZ API just for librarians. In this case, we're getting 42,000 records. And jumping through to constructing a call. So the first part of a URL, I think generally these days most people just ignore it. Kind of comes for free, or you probably don't even have to type that. But so we'll ignore that. Oh, that was a different color and more aligned on my previous screen. So this is the base URL. It's just digitalnz.org, but you put an API dot on the front. And then, I guess you can see my mouse. This part's supposed to be red, so that's what we're talking about. This is the endpoint of the API records in this case. You might also want to see, rather than records being returned, you might want to see users or stories or concepts. So if you were using, say, the Twitter API, it might be tweets, or if it was a YouTube API, the endpoint could be playlists or videos or whatever they call it. But so the endpoint kind of generally is named to give you an indication of what you're going to get back. And then the extension there, .json, is it's just the format that you want to receive it in, and different APIs have different options in terms of what they can return. The DigitalNZ API, you could ask for XML or RSS, and those acronyms are great examples of not being very helpful. I actually didn't know them off the top of my head. I had to look them up. and then I couldn't even be bothered putting them in because they don't make any sense. JavaScript object notation is not very helpful at all. It's just a different view of the same thing. Question mark there is something that is an important part of the constructed URL. So the pattern kind of changes after here. So once you've defined the endpoint you want and the type of response you want, you have to put a question mark, and after that, the pattern is kind of like key value pairs. So name and value. So the name of the field is API key, and then you'd enter your API key as the value there. And for working with our API and most APIs, you often need a key to sort of identify yourself and enable us to just sort of manage access control and monitor some things behind the scenes. So that's a kind of compulsory field, I guess, on the API call. Then we've got this ampersand here ends up being the separator. So I said after the endpoints, the question mark breaks the pattern into just key value separated by ampersand. So you can then add request parameters, as many as you like, separated by ampersands. You could add text equals hypnotized lobster, just for a general search, in the same way that anyway there's a search, you enter some words into a text box, that's what you'll get, a search box. And if you want to be more specific, and we'll go into this, I think in the next slide, you can define, I want the year to be 1910, so you're asking for records that are to do with hypnotized lobster and year 1910. So there's a bunch of stuff you can do in terms of those request parameters. You can just keep chaining them on, separated by ampersands, and build up the search that you want to define the query that you want. And you don't really need to sort of know these. You just need to know that what kind of things you could ask, and then you just have, if you're working with an API or our API, you just have the API docs open in a tab or whatever, and sort of refer to that to build your query as you go. You can do lots of Boolean kind of combine Boolean values in constructing your search. There's paging through if you want to get more than just the first page of results. When you're getting thousands, millions of results coming back from your search, it doesn't all come at once. Faceting down the bottom of this is a different way of searching. So it's like a breakdown of the same set of search results, but it's like a breakdown of viewing those results from a different angle, or which we'll go into in a sec. Sorting, you can sort the results, but these are all available on the DigitalNZ API docs and more information and examples. And so we can go there if you want more. Right, example call. If we look at this a bit closer, you just kind of skip past the base URL. Yep, we want records, skipping past the API key, which you have to have. Then you can see the sort of important part of the call is text dog in this case. The star represents a wildcard. So for wildcard searches, each API, I guess, will have a different wildcard. In our case, it's a star. Then there's an ampersand separating the next parameter, which in this case is category images. So this is a search result for images of docs, getting 11,000 items. And here is the faceting that I spoke about earlier. It's not all that common, but it's quite interesting. It can be quite interesting digging into just a different representation or a different sort of inquiry into the results, or into what we have in DigitalNZ. This is the same search, so text dogs, category images, and then actually jumping to the last parameter of all of those ones separated by ampersands, facets equals content partner. So this is a breakdown of the content partners. So where those results are coming from, you get a count and a content partner. You can request the facet to be on date or category, to have different views of that content. Okay. Now, if I can figure out how to get out of here and go to, whoops. Just turn off some things. So if we go to DigitalNZ, into the developers section, is a good place to see the APIs, where the API is being used. So we started DigitalNZ. I've been with DigitalNZ for quite some time now, and it started off right from the start with quite a strong vision in terms of the core kind of value of the whole business around being built around APIs. And this is before APIs were all sort of that popular. And I think it's kind of, initially it took a while. We were just sort of like felt like we could have been sort of shut down at any moment, you know, if the funding got cut or something like that. But these days we're being used, the API itself is being used in quite a variety of services, and top of the list here is National Library. So we've proven ourselves kind of a worthy kind of thing, embedding the API in some pretty important websites.
Dan, I don't know if this is the case for everybody, but we can still just see your slides. Is that the case for everybody else? So we can't.
Okay, no, I'm sure I'm looking at something else.
Browser open.
I'll try and sort that out. New share. Browser share.
Yeah, sweet.
Nice. Okay, thanks for that. So, yep, I just navigated to DigitalNZ, clicked on developers, and this is a good list of where the API is being used. National Library, or any search you do on the National Library will be searched over, you know, with the DigitalNZ API. Pond, I tried to have a look to see what they're up to these days. I haven't heard too much, but they were built into that service. If you know much about that, it's, I think, an education-based service that at one point was going to be rolled out into all schools. Seismic is a cool example of, and same with the next one, WW100. So that if people can use our API and kind of leverage all the work we've done to build up this collection of, you know, 200 plus content partners and over 300 collections, 26 million items. So the API provides access to that, and you can sort of pretty quickly plug it into, if you focus on building a website, all you have to do is build the website and not worry about managing all that content. So these are some good examples of just spinning up a website that is then focused on a different portion of the DigitalNZ content. Web100 is just a search box that just pulls directly from our API. Europeana, I think, does a similar thing. Maybe you can facet, you can sort of dive down and filter in to content from DigitalNZ. Any questions is just quite very specific. Like that search box will just be searching one collection rather than the 300 that we have. Lifelines table is all powered by all the content you see coming back. It's coming back via DigitalNZ API. We've got some sort of, these are all nothing really to do with us, so this is all just people maybe tinkering. Maybe might be a fun sort of thing that they've built in their spare time. Some quite interesting different views on the data. This one here, one of the newer ones, is quite a interesting approach to using an API, plugging it into Google Docs. If you're building something, you can run a little search and then find images that you might want to use within your docs. So those are all built with the API, and we have another kind of type of use, quite a common one, is having a widget, which I can have a go at showing here. On the Heritage Images website, so this is not to do with us yet, it's just searching their content on their own website. But then it's a common thing that like other websites have done is just put a little plug-in down the bottom here that is pulling related items from DigitalNZ. So this is just running the same query that you've run at the top of this, and you can go and see a hat straight through to Papa. And the DigitalNZ, we try not to get in the way, just send people straight through, so you kind of wouldn't know that we have had anything to do with this. Or you might click on the More button, which will take you to see everything from DigitalNZ on that same search. And there are a bunch of websites that are doing that kind of thing. Let's see what else I had to say. No, I think that's all I had. I don't want to get too confused between what screen I'm sharing. So if there are any questions anyone has, I can't see.
You can just give people time to either ask them in the chat or verbally.
Should try and find my way back to the screen, the right screen.
I think if you just unclick share screen at the bottom, I think that takes it off.
Stop share, that'll probably do it.
There you go. Yep. Perfect. Cool. So no one has any questions?
Sorry about the missing out on some of those amazing transitions. And,
You have to do just another one for us next year or something.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
I was just going to quickly say, Dan, I wonder whether it's worth just at the end just taking everyone to the developers section of the DNZ website, which requires you to screen share again. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Just so people kind of know where to go. Like, for example, if you want to get an API key or get some tips on how to use the API, just to show people where that content is.
Sure. Could do that. All right, up to the top. So I might have briefly mentioned the API docs being a useful thing if you're working with our API or any API. You'll find hopefully some pretty good documentation. So we have, I talked about endpoints. So records is probably the most common one for people to use or want to get items out of. We have sets, stories. It's not all that, probably not very well documented. We haven't exactly sort of publicized publicized it, but you do have API access available. Be cool to see some people building something with sets. But if we go into records, there's most of the parameters that you can use to help you refine your query. Examples are generally my favorite part of anyone else's API docs, which we have some down the bottom here. You can control what kind of fields you get back, rather than, I don't know, there might be 100 fields per record. If you're only using some of them, it's quite a common thing to sort of cull that back, and just so that it's more lightweight in the response, both in terms of you know working with it. It's easier for a human to understand, but also I guess it's less data flying around, can be more efficient. And getting an API key is something that you get when you sign in, which might be another downfall of this being a new computer. Oh no, look at that. So once you've signed in, you up over here, you'll get, there's a little bobble in the way for me, my API key. And that will allow you access to, that you can put into the URL. And otherwise, the API call won't work without it. Anything else useful anybody would like to see?
There's a couple of questions that have been asked in the chat. So if you go down there and have a look, there's one from Amanda, and you'll have to follow the link that she popped in there. If you can see that, kind of like halfway up the screen.
If I stop share, find some chat. When we tested this yesterday, we had no trouble chatting.
It's always the way.
There it is. Gotcha.
So from Amanda.
Okay, Amanda. Yeah. Content provider, you need to use an ampersand. So I'll show you in here. So there's the one field that is sort of breaks that is text. So text is just the simple, anything you're going to type into a search box, you just go text equals. But for most other fields, most other request parameters, you need to go and then a square bracket. So the and kind of represents how it's combining once you chain multiple parameters. The and is how it's combining those together. And then the square brackets inside there is the field that you want to search on. And again, this might not work. Content partner, I think it's called.
I think you have to share your screen again.
Oh no.
No, lots of back and forth.
Share screen. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
You go.
Yeah, so you need an to help combine multiple parameters, and then the content partner, I think I was just about to change. And you're kind of usually working alongside the API docs, so you'll, unless you spend a lot of time with an API, you'll get to know the fields and what they're called. But usually you don't actually sort of, that's my approach to programming in general. You don't actually remember anything, you just know what to look it up and have it alongside. So content partner. Another thing that might be called something slightly different. Yeah, so might have been you needed to put an uppercase, or they might they have a full name, so it might be, I'm not sure exactly what they're called down here. Oh, it is just Massey University. So if we got that exactly right, we could put that in into the call. if I can highlight it. Oh, that's painful. Oh, yeah. Cool. I'm just reading a question from Helen.
Do you want to read it out loud so that people who are watching the recording later?
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out how to write the search results to a CSV file using Python. I don't really know what I'm doing. Do you have any advice? Is there a better language to use? I think Python's a pretty good language for that kind of thing. I'm not especially familiar with Python myself, but we do have these code samples and libraries that might help. So I think this is Python is that's a plugin that does the searching, maybe not the writing to CSV, but there's probably a different library you could use that would just sort of output, because I think you could get the results back as JSON, and then there's probably some other common library, because JSON is such a common language, JSON to CSV, or just save it. It's actually, yeah, to map to that to CSV file. Yeah, so if you could try that. Going there would get you halfway there, I think, and then some other library. I'm trying to find my way back to the comments again. Any other comments?
No other comments, but Helen said thanks. So
cool.
Obviously useful. Yeah, I don't think there are any more questions at the moment. Nope. Cool. Well, I might stop recording here then. And thanks everyone who came along. And if you wanted to share the webinar with anyone or watch it again, we do record them and upload the recording to our YouTube channel. So if you just search for LIANZA on YouTube, you'll be able to find it. And they should all come up there for you. So thanks again for coming.